Hi, in this video, we're going to go over how APIs work at a very high level. So API stands for Application Program Interface, which basically all an API does is it connects two computers together so they can be able to transfer data between each other. APIs are very ubiquitous and very widespread. Honestly, I think APIs really do keep the world running, and they're built in the way they transfer because they're one of the most common ways that applications transfer data between two different points. Um, One example of an API is if you have a school app that gives you a list of all your classes. What that API is doing is it is calling it is calling to the school servers, and then it is getting your app is connecting to the school's API, and through the school's API, it is returning a list of all your classes. So for instance, let's say that this right here is your app. And what the app will do is it'll connect to the school's API or the school's servers over here, and it'll put in a request. Then the school's servers, the API will translate that request and will give it to the database. The database will then return the data of your class schedule that you requested to the API, and then the API will return your classes to you and display it on your app. Now you may think, why don't you just call to the database directly? There's many reasons that you won't want to do this, but we're not going to get into the specifics of those. But security is a big one. You don't want somebody having access to your database publicly, because that can be very dangerous. And also, oftentimes, these databases behind are usually in private subnets, or they are behind a lot of firewalls that can only talk to the server so that they're not actually accessible by the internet. So for the most part, if you want to get data from the database, from a company database or something, and you don't actually work at the company, or you're not completely integrated with the company, you're not within the subnet of the company, then you'd have to go through an API. And you may ask yourself, why do you have to do that with an app? Well, especially if it's the school's app, well, in that case, your app is not in the network. Your app is not in the school's network. And because your app is not in the school's network, there it, you are on public internet, therefore you cannot access the database. If you want to get to the database, you have to go through the API, which is like the gatekeeper, to get into the public subnet to be able to get into that private subnet to be able to access the database. But really simply how this works, we'll start off with looking at this picture right here. I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with ports, and what ports do. If you need to plug a thumb drive into your computer, you know you have to go to your USB port to be able to transfer the data between your USB drive and your thumb drive. If you need power, you usually use some kind of power port to be able to transfer power from your home or your office to your computer. If you want to connect to your TV, you'd use an HDMI port, and you'd connect to your TV with an HDMI cable. You'd plug in the HDMI cable into the HDMI port, and then you'd plug in the HDMI cable to the other HDMI port on your TV, and then you can transfer basically video or display from your computer to your TV. So just like these ports, your computers also have network ports that will allow them to connect to different things. For instance, you'll have port 22 that gives you a simple cell that gives you SSH access to a computer. So if you want to talk through scripting or Bash. That's how you'd connect two computers so you could access the terminal. You also have port 3306 that you can use to access, say, a MySQL database if you have one. And finally, you have port 80. Port 80 allows you to connect to things via HTTPS, which allows you to get out to the internet. There's a lot more ports out there, but these are just some examples, and we are going to be focusing on port 80. So what happens is we'll come back to, we'll take these two and copy them down here. So you have your computer here, you have your computer here, and you have a server over here with a database that it's hooked up to. And so this database will be in its own private subnet that's locked, and then this server will be in a public subnet, and then the server will be able to access this private subnet, and then this server will then have access to a port over here, and we'll call this port 80, and through that port you are able to, that's how this server is able to attach to the internet. And you can find that port using an IP address. So every public port will have some kind of IP address associated with it, so it can find where that port is located. So when you say, like, you are trying to get a website, for instance, you go on your web browser. What you're doing is you are calling to this port. You are finding this IP address, and when you find, if you type in this specific IP address within your web browser, then that will take you to that port. Now, more often than not, though, we don't type in IP addresses, but rather, or we type in some kind of URL. And when we type in a URL, what we're doing is we are going to a DNS service. And here's a quick diagram of what this looks like. And when you put in a URL into your web browser, what it then does is it transfers you to some other server called a DNS that has a list of URLs that match up with different IP addresses. This is why you'll go to different services and you'll look for if domain names are open. Basically, what you're doing is you're seeing if the URL you want, if it's not already attached to an IP address, then you can go ahead and buy that domain and have it. And what that does is basically when somebody types in that specific URL, it goes to this DNS database, and from that DNS database, it then finds whatever IP address is associated with that URL. It'll return that back to your web browser, and then you can attach the web server. So you'll put in a URL, and that will hit the DNS server. The DNS server will come back with an IP address for you, and then through that IP address, you're able to find that port. And then this website that you're accessing will can send you files, and usually it'll send you HTML files, so it will return web pages. But you can also notice if you right click on an image and you open up that image in a new tab, instead of returning you an HTML file or a website, it'll just return you an image. So APIs do almost, when you access an API, you basically do the exact same process, and I'll do this in the demonstration. But essentially, you're putting in a very special URL, and what that URL you're attaching to the server, and then the server will interpret that URL request, bring back data from the database that you're asking for, and rather than sending you a website, it will send you a some kind of data file, usually a JSON file, or some kind of or another type of text file with the data that you want. Normally, though, when you call an API, you don't do it through using a web browser. You'll usually do it through some kind of application. In our case, we're going to be using Python. But at a really high level, that is all that an API is doing. It is very useful just to know how to interact with APIs because they're so ubiquitous, and it is useful to also kind of understand what's happening underneath the hood when you make an API request.